bookaholics, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going through my February wrap-up, and these are all of the books that I managed to read, and then there were a couple of books that towards the end of the month I didn't quite finish as well. So let's talk about them. First of all, I did 3 readathons throughout the month of February, one of which being Polarthon, which is hosted by Jade over at JD Ray Reads. I also participated in FaRoFeb, which is Fantasy Romance February, and I also participated in Blackathon. Blackathon wasn't actually hosted this year. I just like doing Blackathon throughout February because in the US it is Black History Month. And then I also had a few books that were from series that I needed to read, and also an arc as well. Let's get into the books because there were quite a few of them. Starting out with the Polarthon books, I had one book that I rolled over from January, and that is The Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Owl. This is the series read along that I'm doing on my channel, but I think that I'm probably going to cancel that. I am going to continue on to book 2 and see how I feel, but I don't feel like this series is probably going to be for me. I will give book 2 a chance, and you never know, but I didn't like this one enough to actually be like, hey everyone, come read this with me. So this series is the Earth Children series, and this first book follows Isla, who is a young woman who is a Homo sapien who is taken in by a group of Neanderthal, and she is basically mostly accepted, although deemed rather strange, however despised by the leader's son. One of the biggest issues that I have with this book is the level of historical inaccuracy around Neanderthal, especially things like, for example, Neanderthal can't show emotion on their face, and so for example they think that Isla crying is a disease, which was a choice. Like, monkeys cry, you know? Like, why wouldn't Neanderthal cry? It's a very strange one. But there were lots of things in here, the treatment of women, the role of women in this society. So much of it was really, really icky, and I was very uncomfortable by it. However, there were some beautiful depictions of life during this time period. The gathering, the making of fires, the living in caves. All of those things were really, really interesting and really well done. So I did enjoy it. I just had issues with it, and I don't know if that's going to get any better or not as the series goes on, hence why I kind of am tentatively just going to give book 2 a try instead. It's a very slow paced classic fantasy style book, so it also, you know, is quite a lot when reading. There were lots of things in here that I liked, so it's not like I hated this experience. I'm more of a, I had problems and we'll see how I go with the rest of the series. I ended up giving this one a 3-star. The next one that I ended up finishing was Cold from the North by D.W. Ross. This is the first book in the Onyxborn series, and in this series we are following a young man who is from this kingdom that is being invaded, and therefore he must undertake a perilous journey to go and seek aid. This story has Onyxborn of these magical looming threats that was absolutely fascinating, and then there were lots of angles that this story kind of tackled. We have a great friendship going on here, a discussion around essentially being refugees, around how to still be a people when your place in the world has been taken. So I did really enjoy this book. It did take me a while to get into it, but that might have genuinely just been a mindset thing. But it's a Norse inspired setting, which was also fascinating. So I had a really good time with it by the end. I think that it really grew on me, and I'm really glad that I took the time and gave it the chance to grow on me. So great book, and I'm glad that I read it. Bear with it. If for some reason, like me, you're a bit like, oh, this isn't what I was expecting from an Norse-inspired book, it does pull through. The last one that I read for Polarthon was The Winter Road by Adrienne Selby. This one I really liked the beginning of. I got a bit bored in the second half, and then the last bit is epistolary. Epistolary means it's written in letters, and when I tell you, epistolary is hit or miss for me anyway, and every single thing that makes epistolary a miss for me was in the end of this book. So it went from like could be eventually a 5-star if it keeps going to like, oh, 4-star, it petered out a bit, to barely scraping a 3-star because of the epistolary. So it did have a downward spiral, especially because we're centering this woman who is trying to get home. Essentially, she needs to traverse this really hostile landscape to go get home, and it's all of the things that happen in between. This is set over many years. She's a warrior, she is a mercenary, and we're following all the things that she gets roped into, all of the, you know, death threats that she gets, and near hangings and stuff. But one of my issues that I have with this is that the ending makes it seem like we're only interested in this woman because of this important man. And that's another thing that absolutely pissed me off, because we've been following this woman throughout this whole book. And yeah, I had issue with a lot of the things in here by the end of it, and it's barely scraped a 3-star. And that's just because of core power, because in my head it's more of a 2-star. The next readathon that we're going to talk about is FaRoFeb. I read 4 very popular fantasy romances in a vlog, which I will leave linked. I'll leave all the vlogs linked. And for this one, the first one that I started with was When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This one is the story of a young woman who is an assassin who gets caught and is about to be executed. However, she ends up being rescued by one of the kings and is taken to this haven. In this world, there are dragons. It's very Sarah J. Maas coded, but has a very flowery writing that I enjoyed. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. It could have been a 5-star, but there was a bit in the middle there where the, you know, third act breakup bit happens and you have this really dumb protagonist that would just like, yeah, I really can't in good conscience give this 5 stars. But I did have a good time with it, and I am glad that I read it. This was probably my favorite of that vlog. The next one that I read, I started Guild by Raven Kennedy, and then I had to put it down for a bit because I was having a migraine and I was reading it digitally, and then I picked it back up. So we'll talk about Guild next. And this one is a King Midas retelling. In it, we are following King Midas and his gold-touched concubine, Orin. Orin is the protagonist of our story. She was gold touched by Midas, and therefore she is essentially made of gold. She can move around and everything, but she's made of gold. And then one day when Midas is moving all of his possessions from one place to another, the caravan gets attacked and she has to face the real world for the first time in a long time. This was an interesting story, but I had issues with the discussions around consent and around sex. I think that it was a little bit too extreme the way it was depicting rape and the threat of rape. And I do also think that, so the thing that really did bring it down a star for me was that there was a scene that definitely felt like one person was more valuable than another when it comes to depicting rape on page, which I took exception to. So I am interested enough to continue the series, and I think it was really well written. The characters were thought out, really in-depth characters, and I really appreciated having Oren's inner thoughts. I really did like that. And I also really did appreciate some of the conversations around consent, around sex work, etc. And the setting is fascinating. I just had some issues with how the rape was depicted, the angle that it was kind of framed from. So while the conversation that was trying to be had was really important, there were some things that didn't quite land with me personally. That being said, I did end up giving this a 4-star, and I am going to continue. However, I think I need some space from it. The next one that I picked up, so this was during my migraine lapse, and all of the books that I had planned for my FaRoFeb video were all digital books, so I needed a physical book, and I only had one physical read that was a fantasy romance. So I picked up Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This is one that I feel like if you're new to romantasy, if you are wanting to get into romantasy, I understand why people like this. If you have ever read romantasy before though, I don't quite understand why this one is deemed exciting, because I just didn't feel like it added anything new to the genre. We have dragons again. In this story, we are following a young woman who is basically forced to join the dragon riders, and therefore she has a disability, so she is very concerned about her survival of the dragon riders, but she applies her intellect to kind of overcome her disability and therefore survive within the dragon riders. And we have a romance with a guy whose father incited a rebellion that her mother quashed, so they should be natural enemies, but they end up becoming lovers. And yeah, it was an interesting one in the sense that, like, okay, the dragons were kind of cool. We didn't really get much of the dragons though, like we definitely should be getting more of the dragons. And by the end of it, I just wasn't as enamored invested, and I really, really did not vibe with the writing style, which is probably where my investment was failing me. I just don't think it was well written. I just don't think that there was any prose to it. Like, it's just like your mates just telling you the story, you know, someone's giving you the summary synopsis. It had that much level of prose to it, which, having read When the Moon Hatched, which is of course also a fantasy romance with dragons, that has this really nice writing style. Granted, not the most original thing, and the protagonist is basically Selena Sardosian 2.0, but at least it had a prose. This one didn't even have that, and I didn't feel like any of it was hugely innovative. So it was fine. I didn't have a horrible time while reading it. Like, I kind of vibed with it enough to finish it, and it got a 3-star. I'm fine with it. Probably won't be continuing the series. And the last one that I read for my FaRoFeb vlog was The Crimson Moth by Kirsten Ciccarelli. This one is the story of a young woman who is in a world where witches used to be the ruling class and were overthrown when she was younger. Her grandmother insists our protagonist turn her in, because her grandmother is a witch, so that she can save herself. She won't be deemed as someone who is harboring a witch, and she will be trusted because she hands over her own grandmother. So that's exactly what she does. And then when she grows up and she comes into her power, she uses that power to then go free witches and save witches. And she must go find her grandmother's friend Seraphine. However, when she gets to where Seraphine has been hiding, it's obvious that the witch hunters have gotten there before her. So she now must cozy up to one of the more prominent witch hunters so that she can hopefully eke out information as to where Seraphine might be. In the meantime, the head of the witch hunters also wants to cozy up to her because he believes that maybe she's the Crimson Moth, which is her vigilante name. I had a good time with this. To begin with, I was just kind of like going along with it, like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And then by the end of it, I was really invested in it. We have this love triangle that is actually done in a way that works, because it's not a love triangle in the sense of you have these two guys that are pretty much identical to each other, just butting heads with each other over a girl. You have this really complex dynamic between 3 people. You have this girl who has the guy that's always been there, that she trusts, that she has always cared for, but just isn't in love with. And then you have the guy that she is really attracted to, that she knows she can't get with. And then you have these 2 guys that also have a loyalty to each other and don't want to fuck that up, and therefore don't want to fight over a girl. And it was a lot more layered and complex than you normally get, and I really appreciated that. So there were so many things. We get the guys in a monologue, we get his perspective. He is a victim of domestic abuse as well. So we also have a male who is shown to have a level of vulnerability and never emasculated for it. So that was handled really well as well. I ended up giving this 4 stars because, as I said, it did take me a little while to get into. That might be a me thing because I really don't read YA anymore. So I think maybe I was just expecting a little bit more from it too early on. Like, I think you need to kind of ease people into things maybe more in YA. So that's possibly more me than the book, but I had a great time with it and I am very excited to continue. I think the second book has just come out, so hopefully I can finish up this series soon. For Blackathon, I used my spinner wheel to randomize my picks and choose my books for me. I thought having a wider range of different types of books by Black authors would suit me better, hence why the wheel was a good idea. And the first one that the wheel chose for me is Love by Toni Morrison. This is a standalone by one of my favorite literary fiction authors, and this one we are following mostly 2 women who are named Christine and Heed, who are related to this man named Bill Cozy. Bill Cozy, prior to the civil rights movement, was the owner of a Black only hotel. So it was a hotel for upper class Black people, and then obviously post the civil rights movement, Black people started entering into white spaces, which means they had no need for an upper class segregated hotel, and therefore the business began to decline. So then we are following these 2 women who, after his demise, are left with reconciling his effect on their lives and also his remaining wealth. And it's a fascinating story because we are following it from 2 women who have clearly been wronged by this man, but at the same time still think so fondly of him. And it was an interesting story around how a bad person can still be so beloved. And I loved the depictions in here, the conversations in here, the way Toni Morrison goes about things. There's always so many layers and it's so complex and it's not just really clean cut. So I had a great time with this and I love everything that Toni Morrison writes. The next thing the wheel chose for me was was Far from the Light of Heaven by Tade Thompson. This is a Afrofuturistic sci-fi in which we are following a colony ship named Ragtime, which is taking a load of colonizers in hypersleep from Earth to the planet Bloodroot. Captained by the ship itself, it captains itself with an AI named Ragtime. And we also have the first mate, which is Michelle Shell Campion. It's a very fascinating story to me because it doesn't sound like anything new. So basically we have this ship and then Michelle wakes up and finds that several of the sleepers have been murdered. The AI is malfunctioning and now she and one of the investigators from Bloodroot need to go investigate what actually happened on the ship while she was in hypersleep. One of the things for me that I really appreciated is that this story sounds like so many sci-fis. There are a ridiculous amount of space operas that are people in hypersleep, someone wakes up, something is wrong. Like, that is literally the bread and butter of space odysseys. So I loved the way that this one went about it, that it actually still felt fresh, still felt exciting. This has hugely anti-capitalist sentiment throughout. We have a planet that has rejected capitalism to the point of it being deemed dirty to want to destroy your planet for the sole purpose of financial gain. We have discussions around discrimination, interspecies discrimination, and police brutality and violence. We have conversations around the faults of billionaires and the wealthy harboring wealth while they profit off of the hard-working working classes. So many anti-capitalist statements going on in this story, and I loved it. It had so many conversations, and the AI felt really real. The characters felt really real. Getting the different angles from different characters. So you have the backup AI watching Michelle as she is trying to scramble around the ship and figure out what on earth has gone on. We have a detective, Rashid, who then comes on to the ship to investigate. And we have his AI, Salvo, who is observing both Rashid and Michelle. So many perspectives and the different angles that brings to this investigation and the different conversations they in themselves bring. Fantastic. Loved it. Would highly recommend. Book of the month. The next thing that the wheel chose for me was a series, and that was the Great Cities series by N.K. Jemisin, consisting of The City We Became and The World We Make. This is the story of New York City. In this world, cities have souls, and at a certain point, they will awaken. And we have New York City is awakening, as are all of its boroughs. And we are following it from the perspective of avatars for each of the boroughs. And we have a villain who is trying to stop the city from fully awakening. I had issues with this series, which I don't normally with Jemisin, but I had issues with it partly because of my tastes and partly I think because of the books. So on my part, I don't care about New York City. New York City, London, Paris, Tokyo, I am done with. I am just done with them as settings. I cannot be bothered. I do not care. So for me, I didn't care about New York City, which is literally the protagonist of the book. One of the things that I was hoping, because I love N.K. Jemisin, I was hoping that there would be layering to this from someone who isn't from New York City to learn a little bit more about what being in New York is like. Not what we see in the movies, because even the nitty-gritty that's shown in the movies is either like super cool gangster or it's, it's gritty and it's hard, but it's worth it because it's New York. And I just wanted something that was like, do you know what? Actually, this part just sucks. Or, here's a realistic take on this. This is an angle that can be pitched in a way that still feels authentically New York. I didn't feel like I learned anything new about New York from this book, which, given that you have avatars that represent entire boroughs, I feel like I should. I did really like the way that avatars represented the boroughs. I think that it was a really nuanced discussion because in and of itself, each avatar was a conversation about the borough and what it represents. One of the problems that I also had was the villain. The villain definitely is the kind of character. It just didn't feel like a person. They were representing something, which is fine, but I didn't understand their motivations. And I don't vibe with villains that just are villainous for the sake of it, especially because the villain gets affiliated with one of the avatars. And the avatar is villainous. They have issues. They have a reason why they are the way they are, but they are problematic, to say the least. So I cared more about this avatar than I did about the actual villain. And I felt like the villain almost signified that anyone who is malevolent is just possessed by this one villain, instead of it being a more nuanced conversation. So there were certain things that just didn't work for me around this villain. And then finally, the other issue that I had is that the second book has a multiverse, and I don't really vibe with multiverses either. So between New York City and a multiverse, it kind of had it stacked against it. I do really love N.K. Jemisin's writing style. I do really love the conversations that were had in these books, and I do think that they are really valuable reads. And if you like New York City, you'll love these books because they're an ode to New York City. If you like kind of like eldritch horror vibes, but you want urban fantasy version, I think you'll love this. I'm not a fan of urban fantasy. So there are a lot of things that were stacked against it, but I still really appreciate these books. And I think, as I said, they were having important conversations. There were just things that just really didn't work for me. So I ended up giving them a low 4-star, and I'm happy with that. I think that I went in potentially with high expectations because Jemisin is my favorite author. So maybe it was that as well. Like, I'm a bit disappointed at them not being a 5-star. They were still good books and I would still recommend them. They just didn't really work for me as much as I wanted them to. And the last book that I read for Blackathon ended up being The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This is the story of a young woman named Cora and her fight for freedom from slavery. We are in the antebellum South, and the Underground Railroad in this story is a literal underground railroad as opposed to just a network of people aiding fugitive slaves. The story is speculative. As I said, the Underground Railroad is an actual railroad, and we also see different societies that are fictional during this time period, but that are very representative of either mindsets or things that were actually happening during this time, reframed to emphasize. And I loved that. Colson Whitehead has a fantastic writing style that was super easy to get through. And we're reading about these traumatic events in a way that neither minimizes, romanticizes, or is purely there for shock value. It is literally just discussing the way that slaves were treated. And I really appreciated that because it didn't feel clinical either. It wasn't this detached, inhuman, well, that's just what happened storyline either. It was just, this is what happened, and how do you feel about that? At no point did I feel like Colson Whitehead was holding my hand and telling me what conversations I should be having with this book and what feelings I should be feeling. He presented the facts and the fiction that would frame the facts in a way that then allowed me to think. And I love books that do that. So I was really, really glad to have read this. It was a fantastic story. I ended up giving it a 4.5 instead of a 5 because it does end with the usual narrative that you have around Antebellum South, which is someone, the protagonist or a side character or someone, ends up being a freed slave or a runaway slave that goes north. And Colson Whitehead is exactly the right person to be able to have conversations around what the North actually is and how it was safer than the South, but it wasn't just this beautiful paradise where everyone sang Kumbaya. And I really would have loved for him to go into it because he is the kind of person that would have had such a nuanced and level conversation with it. And I felt a bit robbed because I didn't want it to end there because I wanted more conversations. I wanted that important extra information that we always leave out when we talk about the divide between the North and the South. So obviously that wasn't the book's intent. That's not the book's fault, but it's still something that I wanted more from. So I didn't know how to go about that, so I just ended up being like, well, I wanted more, and I think that an important conversation was kind of left out, so I ended up with a 4.5, but everything else about this was absolutely fabulous. The last book that I finished in its entirety in February was Wolves of the Calla by Stephen King. This is the 5th book in the Dark Tower series, and sadly the last that I will be reading. I am not going to go and read books 6 and 7. This one got a 1.5 on Core Pile. I have rounded it up to 2 stars, but I don't know why I'm reading these books anymore. I don't understand the characters' motivations. I don't understand the characters. I don't understand the plot. I don't know why we're doing what we're doing. And the only reason I think that people think these are cool is because of how meta it is within Stephen King's other works. I'm not gonna lie. And maybe if you vibe with Roland. I don't vibe with Roland. And I don't care about Stephen King's other works. So there is no reason for me to be reading these books. And I'm really tired of coming on here and shitting on a series that is beloved by other people just because I'm deciding to continue to push through a series I'm not having a good time time with. So I am stopping now, and I will talk about these no more. I did get partway through some other books. So I did get into The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson, and I did get halfway through Dead House Gates by Stephen Erickson, but I will talk about those obviously in my March wrap up. Another book that I had very nearly finished by the end of February that I will talk about though, because it does come out at the beginning of March, so I figured that I would talk about it even though I did technically finish it slightly in March, and that is Servant of Rage by Alex Knight. This is a progression and cultivation fantasy in which we are following three brothers who are descendants from this great Khan. This great Khan had this huge amount of power, and obviously that power died with him. So now the heirs are kind of scrambling to keep this empire afloat and not lose all its territories that their grandfather had ascertained. However, when the brothers accidentally break something that had actually been harboring the Khan's power, all of his power gets dispersed across the continent and is distributed amongst all of his heirs. So then we have these brothers who learn that if they kill the heir, they acquire their power. As is the catchphrase, kill an heir, claim their magic. So we have these brothers that are then going around trying to acquire all of this magic for themselves. And it's a fascinating story. I'm not a huge progression fantasy reader. I have read maybe one or two before, I think. So it's not really my jam. And one of the reasons that I'm not the biggest fan of progression fantasy is that I feel like the characters are supposed to be a bit distant because the focus is supposed to be on the magic and on the world. And I find that that distance doesn't work for me because I want there to be more character connection, especially when you're talking about them killing their relatives. Interested in the story, and I'm interested in continuing. I just wish I connected more with the characters than I did. It's really well written, and it was fascinating the angles that the author chose to discuss the world, the magic, the plot. I just wish that I cared more emotionally as much as I did intellectually. So while I had a really good time with this, and I definitely would consider continuing on with the series, it's not new favorite territory yet either. But again, that's mostly probably me not being much of a progression fantasy reader, and therefore I'm a little bit disconnected from it. But for progression fantasy readers, if you really like a Mongolian aesthetic fantasy world, coupled with the progression and cultivation fantasy, coupled with a lot of violence and a lot of just, again, people killing their literal relatives, I would highly recommend you check this one out because I do think that for within the genre, it's actually a very good example of a book. It's just something that I'm having to work on getting used to. And there you have it. Those are all the books that I read in February. It was a lot of reading. I was unwell for a lot of it, so I was literally just lying in bed reading. And then I also have been really focusing on reading this month because I had my obligation reads, I had all of my vlog planned, so it's been very central. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do quite as much in March, even though it's a longer month, just because I have other things that I need to be focusing on throughout the month. February is a very slow work month for me, but March is a very, very hectic one, so the chances are I won't be reading anywhere near as much. But I'm glad that I read all the things that I read, and I think the vlog projects worked out well as well. So let me know in the comments down below what your best book in February was. Let me know if you've read any of these and your thoughts on them, or if based on my liking of these books you have any other recommendations, also in the comments below. But that is all for me for today, so thank you ever so much for watching, and I will hopefully catch you in another one soon.